That trial was not chaotic. It was procedural. It followed structure. Questions were asked. Witnesses were called. A formal charge was declared. And yet, within hours, a man was condemned to death. The accusation? Blasphemy. But here is the problem. When we place the gospel accounts beside what we know of Jewish legal procedure in the Second Temple period, something becomes deeply uncomfortable. Certain elements of that night should not have happened the way they did. Not the timing, not the setting, not the verdict. By the end of this investigation, you will understand what the gospel narratives actually describe, what Jewish law required in capital cases, and whether the men who condemned Jesus were operating within their own legal framework or outside it. In the 1st century, Judea was under Roman occupation. Political authority ultimately belonged to Rome, but internal religious and many civil matters were governed by Jewish leadership. Imagine a city divided by two invisible walls, Roman law above, Jewish tradition below. Both were real, both had teeth, and a man caught between them had very little room to survive. The highest judicial body in Jerusalem was the Sanhedrin. The Mishnah, compiled around 200 AD but preserving earlier traditions, describes procedures for capital cases in Tractate Sanhedrin. While the Mishnah postdates Jesus by over a century, historians such as E.E.P. Sanders and Geza Vermes note that it likely reflects legal ideals rooted in earlier Pharisaic tradition. Capital cases were treated with extreme caution. According to Mishnah Sanhedrin 4.1, capital cases required multiple judges. Witness testimony had to agree precisely. Verdicts of acquittal could be delivered the same day. Verdicts of conviction required a delay until the following day. The principle was clear. Jewish law leaned toward preserving life. Now hold that framework in your mind, because the Gospel of Mark presents a very different sequence of events. According to Mark 14:53-65, Jesus is taken to the high priest. Chief priests, elders, and scribes gather. Mark 14:55 states, "The chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none." Witnesses are brought forward. Their testimonies do not agree. Mark 14:56. Finally, two witnesses claim Jesus said, "I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands." Mark 14:58. Even then, Mark notes that their testimony did not agree. At this point, the high priest directly questions Jesus. "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Mark 14:61. Jesus responds, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Mark 14:62. That statement merges Psalm 110:1 and Daniel 7:13. The high priest tears his garments and declares, "You have heard the blasphemy." Mark 14:64. And they condemn him as deserving death. All of this appears to occur in a single night, and that is where the legal questions begin. To understand why this was explosive, we must examine the texts Jesus invoked. Think of it this way. Jesus did not simply answer a question. He reached into the most sacred prophetic texts of Israel and placed himself inside them. Daniel 7:13-14 describes one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven and receiving authority, glory, and dominion from the Ancient of Days. In Jewish apocalyptic thought, this figure carries divine authority, the kind no ordinary human could claim. Psalm 110:1 states, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool." To sit at God's right hand was not a metaphor. It was the language of supreme authority in the cosmos. When Jesus combined these two texts in direct response to the high priest's question, he was not claiming to be a teacher or even a prophet. He was claiming to be the eschatological judge of Israel, the one who would one day stand before God and receive dominion over all nations. From the council's perspective, this left only two possibilities. Either the claim was true, in which case they were about to condemn the very figure Daniel had prophesied, or it was blasphemy and had to be stopped immediately. Now we examine the procedural evidence. There are four specific tensions between the Gospel account and Jewish legal procedure. Mark 14 suggests a nighttime gathering. The Mishnah indicates capital cases were to be tried during the daytime. However, historians debate whether this rule was firmly applied in the pre-70 AD period. What we can say is this: if the night meeting occurred, it fell outside the legal ideal, even if not a clear violation of codified law at that moment in history. The Mishnah requires that conviction in capital cases be delayed until the following day, allowing time for reconsideration. In Mark's narrative, condemnation appears immediate. Yet Matthew 27:1 notes, "When morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel." This suggests a formal ratification at daylight. Scholar N.T. Wright argues the night gathering may have been a preliminary hearing, with official confirmation at dawn. If so, the letter of the law may have been satisfied, but the spirit of it was not. Mark explicitly notes that witness testimonies did not agree. Mark 14:56. Under Deuteronomy 19:15, two consistent witnesses were required for conviction. The prosecution failed its own evidentiary standard. The shift from inconsistent witnesses to direct self-incrimination through Jesus' own words becomes legally crucial and deeply unusual. In Jewish legal thought, confession alone was insufficient in capital cases. The Talmud later states that no one could incriminate himself in a capital matter. But here, Jesus' direct statement becomes the sole basis for the charge. Whether that precise standard applied identically in the 30s AD remains debated by scholars. But the tension is real and historically significant. The Gospel accounts show an escalation that reveals a deliberate legal strategy. After the Sanhedrin declares Jesus worthy of death, they do not execute him. Why? Because under Roman governance, capital execution required Roman authorization. Josephus confirms that after 6 AD, Judea's prefect controlled capital punishment. So Jesus is taken to Pontius Pilate. And this is where the story becomes even more legally complex. The charge changes completely. Luke 23:2 records, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Blasphemy would not concern Rome. Kingship would. Before the council, theological crime. Before Rome, political threat. The same man. Two entirely different charges. This is not confusion. It is legal strategy. Pilate questions him about kingship. Mark 15:2. Roman law was concerned with sedition, not theology. The process moves from religious charge to imperial threat, and the outcome becomes inevitable. Did they break their own law? The answer depends on how rigidly we project later rabbinic codifications back into the year 30 AD. The Mishnah preserves legal ideals. The Gospels preserve narrative memory. Roman history preserves political reality. What emerges is not a chaotic lynching. It is a layered legal movement, from accusation to theological provocation to political reframing to Roman execution. Whether procedural irregularities occurred is debated among scholars. But one fact stands. Jesus' own words, recorded in Mark 14:62, became the decisive turning point. The charge did not rest primarily on false witnesses. It rested on how the council interpreted his claim to authority. And in that moment, law, theology, and politics converged. Not in confusion, but in consequence. Here is what makes this relevant beyond ancient history. Every generation eventually faces a version of this same question. What happens when legal and political systems encounter a claim that their framework was not designed to contain? The council that night was not lawless. They were operating inside their system, and their system could not hold what Jesus represented. Within 3 centuries, the Roman world itself would be transformed by the figure they condemned that night. That is where this story refuses to remain ancient. If this investigation raised more questions than it answered, that is exactly the point. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. And if you want to go deeper on how Roman and Jewish law shaped the world of the New Testament, the next video is already waiting for you.